Bright Tutee. Every student matters.
Hello, dear students. Welcome to another lecture. In this class, we are going to begin with the first chapter of Class 12 Literature Reader Nagaland 4, which is a piece of bread written by Francois Copé. Now, the name of this chapter is talking about a piece of bread and the relevance, the importance of the piece of bread in the life of the narrator. But the theme of this story is friendship. Now, we all understand that friendship is the most beautiful emotion that you can experience, that you can feel. And true friends, there is a very famous quote in English that we people use very frequently, which says, "A friend in need is a friend indeed." So, a true friend can go to any extent for you. What, according to you, could have happened in this chapter in which the narrator felt that true friendship does exist? So, in order to understand that, it is important for us to read this chapter. So, without much ado, let us start with the chapter now. Okay. So, as I said, the writer is introducing to us this chapter by asking us a question: what can you do for your friend? What are the ways you can be of help to somebody who's helped you? Do you think kindness can always be repaid? Think about these questions and discuss about your friendship. What, as I said, is the most beautiful thing that one can experience. Okay, so this story that we are going to read is set in wartime in France in 1870. Now, this story's backdrop was a war-like situation. We all can understand that a war is the most difficult, the harshest, and the roughest time of one's life, specifically the ones who are involved in that war, who are directly a part of the war. So, this is again something that we are going to read. In that war, there were two people who developed friendship, between each other. And friendship was the purest form of feelings that you can have for anybody. So, what did they do for each other that proves that they were the true friends, they were the best of friends, is what we shall read. So, the young Duke de Hardimont happened to be at Aix de Savoy when he read the news of the disastrous engagement at Reichshofen. So the young Duke, there was a young prince whose name was Hardimont, and he was living at Aix in Savoy. He heard about the disastrous engagement, the disastrous mishap, the disastrous war, fight that had taken place at Reichshofen. This is the name of the place where there was a war that was to be started. Upon learning that France had lost a battle on French soil, the young Duke felt the blood mount to his face, giving him a horrible feeling of suffocation. He ordered his valet to pack his trunks and 2 hours later took the express to Paris. So as soon as this Duke got to know that France had lost a battle on the French soil, so, within France, the French soldiers had lost a battle. This made the Duke feel the blood mount to his face. Blood mount to his face means he got angry. He got annoyed, he got frustrated, and this made him feel suffocated. He thought he was not able to breathe. He was not at peace with this thought at all. He then ordered his valet. Now, valet, obviously, we know, is a personal servant. We know that this man we are talking about here is a duke, so he is undoubtedly a very rich man. So the duke ordered his valet to pack his trunks, to pack his bags, and 2 hours later he took the express, he took the train to Paris. There, Henry de Hardemont enlisted himself in a regime of the line, and his regiment formed a part of Vinoy's corps which protected the cannon of the Fort Bicêtre. So he took a train to Paris, and there, that is in Paris, Henry de Hardemont, that is the full name of the Duke, he enlisted himself in a regiment of the line. Regiment of the line means the group of soldiers. He got himself enlisted. He got his name, in those soldiers. In the earlier times, anybody who felt patriotic, anybody who felt the need to fight and protect the nation could become a soldier. It was not that big a deal in the earlier days. So when the Duke felt he could not tolerate the fact that his country was losing on his own soil, he got angry and he went to Paris. He got himself to be a part of a regiment, to be a part of the troop. And the troop that he was a part of, so that troop was a part of Vinoy's. So there were two groups which were formed, and one of them was by the name Vinoy's Corps. And this troop of soldiers was supposed to protect the cannon of Fort Bicêtre. So this is the name of the place they were accountable to protect. So the Duke got himself to be a part of Vinoy's corps and was supposed to protect the cannon of Fort Bicêtre. Now it was a gloomy place, a road planted with clusters of broom and broken up into muddy ruts, traversing the leprous fields of the neighborhood. On the border stood an abandoned tavern, a tavern with arbors where the soldiers had established their post. The appearance of the tavern made one shudder. The roof had been torn by a shell, and the walls seemed whitewashed with blood. So, and all over a wretched winter sky, across which rolled heavy leaden clouds, and odious sky, angry and hateful. So the place that the Duke went to, it was a very gloomy kind of a place, very sad, very disappointing, grey place it was. The road, in that place were planted with clusters of broom. Broom is a kind of shrub. So there were clusters, there were huge bushes of this broom that could be seen on the roads. Then they were broken up into muddy ruts. Muddy ruts, when you see the patches of a very big tire that at times get imprinted on the road because of the frequency with which they pass. Okay, so those were the muddy ruts, the patches, the signs of the big tires of some vehicle traversing the leprous fields of the neighborhood. So these roads, they went on till they extended till far away. So extending to fields of the neighborhood. So as far as the writer could see, the Duke could see, he only saw such roads. On the border stood an abandoned tavern, and on the border, on the edge of this road, there was a tavern. Tavern is a kind of an inn, okay, a small hotel where one can live in. And abandoned means something which is deserted, which is totally alone, empty. So there was a tavern which was abandoned. There were a tavern which had arbors. Arbors means there were shady gardens around that tavern. It was not a very beautiful looking inn. Rather, around the tavern, there were very dirty, very shady looking gardens around it, where the soldiers had established their post. And on those, edges of the taverns where there were shady gardens, the soldiers had been living there. So they were living there in their tents. The appearance of the tavern made one shudder, tremble with fear, shiver with fear. So the tavern looked such that the Duke actually trembled with fear when he saw that. The roof had been torn by a shell. So the roof of the tavern had been torn by a shell. There was probably some bomb or some big shell that was dropped into that tavern, because of which the roof was torn. It had not been repaired. The walls seemed whitewashed with blood. On the walls of the tavern, there were signs of blood. It seemed as if somebody had painted the walls with blood. And overall, a wretched winter sky. Wretched means something which is that you can curse worthy, something which is very bad and unlucky. So there was this winter sky that one could see, across with rolled heavy leaden clouds. Leaden clouds, the silver clouds could be seen in the sky. An odious sky which was angry and hateful. So the sky seemed to be very, very angry, it was hateful, and it was unpleasant. There was nothing beautiful or good in the sky at all. Now, at the door of the tavern stood the young Duke, motionless, with his gun in his shoulder belt, his cap over his eyes, his benumbed hands in the pockets of his red trousers, and shivering in his sheepskin coat. He gave himself up to his sombre thoughts, this defeated soldier, and looked with sorrowful eyes towards a line of hills lost in the fog. Suddenly he felt hungry. So this Duke was standing on the door of the tavern, motionless. He could not move. He was totally awestruck by the sight of that tavern. The gun was there in the shoulder belt. So there was a belt that he was wearing. We've seen such a belt in the movies. It is worn, it covers your shoulders. So in his shoulder belt was his gun. He had a cap on. His hands were benumbed in his pockets. Benumbed means he could not feel his hands because of the cold. So he had put his hands in the pocket of his red trousers, and he was although wearing a sheepskin coat, a very warm woolen coat, but despite that he was shivering. He was shivering with cold. He gave himself up to his sombre thoughts. Sombre, sad. So whatever sad and depressing thoughts he had at that moment, he gave them up, and then he started looking around towards the hills, towards the fog, and everything with sorrow, with sadness in his eyes. Because he just came there because of being patriotic. He wanted to do something for his country. Never had he expected to view something as sad and depressive as he could. And suddenly he felt hungry at that time. Stooping, he drew from his knapsack a piece of bread, and as he had lost his knife, he bit off a morsel and slowly ate it. So as he felt hungry, he stooped down. Stooping, he bent down, and after bending down, he opened his knapsack, his backpack, and from it he took out a piece of bread. Since he had lost his life, so he bit off. He just took a big bite of the bread. Bit of a morsel. Morsel means he took a bite of the bread and he started eating it slowly. But after a mouthful, he had enough of it. The bread was hard and had a bitter taste. No fresh bread would be given until the next morning's distribution. This was certainly a very hard life sometimes. The resemblance of former breakfast came to him, such as he had called hygienic. When he would seat himself by a window on the ground floor of the cafe Antes and be served with a cutlet, buttered eggs with asparagus tips. That was a good time, and he would never become accustomed to this new life of wretchedness. So he just had a few mouthfuls. So he ate a few bites of his bread, and after that he could not eat more. He had enough of it, means he could not eat more because the bread was very hard and it had become very bitter also in taste. The taste also had become bad. He knew that he would not be given fresh bread until the next morning when the fresh things are distributed to the soldiers. It was then when he realized that it was going to be very hard life that he will have to come across. Then he remembered, remembrance of former breakfast. Former means earlier. He remembered the kind of breakfasts he used to have. He used to sit by the window of cafe and lice and have hygienic breakfasts. Cutlet with buttered eggs and with asparagus tips. Asparagus, in return of the breakfast, he would actually give very good tip also to the waiters. That was a good time, and he knew that he would never become accustomed. He would never get into a habit of living this life of wretchedness. This unpleasant life is very hard, is going to be very hard for him to live. And in a moment of impatience, the young man threw the rest of his bread into the mud. So he became very impatient and annoyed at that time, and in that moment, he threw the piece of bread in the mud. At the same moment, a soldier of the line came from the tavern, stooped and picked up the bread, drew back a few steps, wiped it with his sleeve, and began to devour it eagerly. Immediately, what happened? As soon as the Duke threw his bread, a soldier who was there in the tavern, he came out, he bent down, he picked up that bread, he cleaned that bread with his sleeves of the shirt, and he started to devour it. He started to eat it in a very hungry manner. Henry de Hardimont was already ashamed of his action, and now with a feeling of pity, watched the poor devil who gave proof of such a good appetite. He was a tall, large young fellow, but badly made. So, Henry de Hardimont already started feeling very bad for having thrown off something, which could be eaten. And now, when he saw that man who was eating the bread after cleaning the mud of it, he had a feeling of pity. He felt sorry for that man. And he started looking at that man who showed that he was very hungry. He was tall, he was a large young fellow, but badly made. Badly made means his physique was not that good. He had feverish eyes, he had red eyes and a hospital beard. A beard that one develops when one is in the hospital for a long time and you don't get to shave yourself. And so thin that his shoulder blades stood out beneath his well-worn cape. Shoulder blades, we all see there is a bone that we have near our shoulders. So this man was so thin that although he was wearing a cape, he was wearing a coat to cover himself in that winters, still his blades were visible. That was the amount of thin that this man was. "You're very hungry," he said, approaching the soldier. So he came to the soldier, the Duke went near to the soldier and asked him, "You're very hungry." The other man, who already had his mouth full of bread, he replied, "As you see, you can very clearly see that. Excuse me then, for if I had known that you would like the bread, I would not have thrown it away." So the Duke apologized to that man, to that soldier, and said that if I would have known that you would have eaten that bread, you would have eaten that bread, then I would never have thrown this bread away. It does not harm it, replied the soldier. I am not dainty. So the soldier said that I am not dainty. I am not that kind of a person who would have high demands or expectations about something. So that's perfectly fine. I don't mind eating this bread out of the mud also. No matter, said the gentleman. It was wrong to do so, and I reproached myself. But I do not wish you to have a bad opinion for me. Let us drink a drop together. So the Duke said that no matter, whatever the case be, but I really reproach myself. I hate myself for what I have done. So I don't want that you should think ill of me. I don't want you to have a bad opinion about me. So would you like to have a drop together? Means would you like to have a drink with me? Now it says that do you think the Duke is trying to make up for his behavior by trying to be sweet to the man? Was he trying to make up for throwing off the bread like this? So, yes, certainly the Duke was trying to make up for his behavior. We can very evidently see that he was sorry. And what does this tell us about him? This tells us that he was a kind-hearted man. He realized his mistake, and despite being a duke, he did not think twice before apologizing. Okay, so the man had finished eating, the duke, and he drank a mouthful of brandy. The acquaintance was made. So after the man had eaten the bread, the duke and the soldier, they drank brandy, which is a drink, and the acquaintance was made. Acquaintance, they started to know each other better. They got to know each other better. What is your name? Asked the soldier of the line. So that soldier asked the duke what his name was, and he replied, Hardimont. He obviously did not tell him that he was a duke. So he asked the soldier about his name, and the soldier replied that my name is Jean Victor. I have just entered this company, means I have just become a part of this regiment. I am just out of the ambulance. I was wounded at Chatelain. Oh, but it was good in the ambulance. And in the infirmary, they gave me horse fooling. So that soldier, whose name was Jean Victor, he told the Duke that he was wounded. He got himself hurt, because of which he had to go to the infirmary, to the medical dispensary, and then they brought him back in the ambulance. And he said that he liked in the ambulance, and they gave him horse bouillon, they gave him a soup also. But I had only a scratch. I had just a little amount of that soup, and the major signed my dismissal. And the major who was there, he signed, and he had to be dismissed from the ambulance. He could not even finish his entire soup. So much the worse for me. So this is what made that soldier feel bad. Not the fact that he was wounded, that he was injured or was in pain. The fact that he could not finish the soup that was given to him is what made him feel so sad. Now, I am going to commence to be devoured by hunger again. For believe me, if you will, comrade, but such as you see me, I have been hungry all my life. And this man said that now that I am out of the infirmary and ambulance, I will have to again continue being hungry. And he said to the Duke that believe me, comrade, believe me, friend, you might find it very hard to believe, but I have been hungry all my life. He said there has never been a time when I could eat a stomach full of meal. The words were startling, especially to a sybarite who had just been longing for the kitchen of Café Anglais, and the Duke de Hardimont looked at his companion in almost terrified amazement. So he says that The moment that man confessed that he had been hungry for his entire life, these words were startling, these were very shocking, especially for a cyberite, for a person like him who had been habitual of a luxurious life and who only a couple of minutes back was dreaming of going back to Cafe Anglais. And it was at that point that Duke de Harmon, he looked at his companion in terrified amazement. He looked at his companion in shock. He looked at his companion with startlement. The soldier smiled sadly, showing his hungry wolf-like teeth as white as his sickly face. So the soldier smiled at Duke, and when he did so, his white teeth, which have been compared to that of a wolf, were shown to the Duke, and they were very white. As white was his face, were his teeth. Sickly face had because he was so sick that his face was white. There was no blood, hemoglobin. Okay. So that is why his face was very white, and so were his teeth. Come, said he, suddenly ceasing his familiar way of speaking, doubtless divining that his companion belonged to the rich and happy. Let us walk along the road to warm our feet, and I will tell you things which probably you've never heard of. Then that person, that is Jean Victor, he suddenly ceased. Ceased means stopped. So he said, come. And this come that he said was different from the way he had been speaking so far. Because now Jean Victor had divined, he had guessed that his companion was a rich man. He belonged to a rich and happy family. So Jean Victor said to him that, come, let us walk along the road. This will warm our feet, and I will tell you a lot of things about myself that you would never have heard of. So he said that I am called Jean Victor, that is all, for I am a foundling, and my only happy remembrance is of my earliest childhood at the asylum. The sheets were white on our little bed in the dormitory. We played in a garden under large trees, and a kind sister took care of us. She died afterwards of lung trouble. I was her favorite because she used to draw me to her side and lay her warm, thin hand on my forehead. But when I was 12 years old, after my first communion, there was nothing but poverty. So he says that my name is Jean Victor, and that is because I am a foundling, I am an orphan. He says that the best time that he can remember of his life was his earliest childhood when he was too young and he used to be at the asylum. He used to be at that, orphanage, the home that is meant for such kids. He tells us that the sheets of his dormitory, the place where they would sleep, so the bed sheets of his dorm were white in color. They used to play in garden under the large trees, and there was a very kind sister who used to take care of them. She died. The sister, she died because of lung trouble, and tells us that he was the sister's favorite because every night she would draw Jean near to her and would, lay her hand on on his forehead, just the way you do it with everyone and anyone you feel good for. So she used to pat his forehead with her hands. But he says that when he was 12 years of age, he had his first communion. First communion is a service in church where you're offered bread and wine. So after his first communion, after that day, there was nothing but poverty. He only and only faced poverty thereafter. The managers put me as apprentice with a chair mender in Faubourg Saint-Jacques. The master and mistress were terrible misers, and the bread, cut in tiny pieces for each meal, was kept under lock and key the rest of the time. I was always so terribly hungry. Was it my fault, do you think? I served there for 3 years in continual fit of hunger. 3 years. So he further tells us that the managers of his asylum, when he grew up, he was made an apprentice with a chair mender. Apprentice means a helper. So he started helping a chair mender, a person who would repair chairs in Favox and Jackie. Now the master and the mistress, the people he used to work for and work with, they were misers. Misers, they did not have a very big heart. Their heart was very small. They did not believe in sharing and giving anything to anybody. So they would always eat bread which was cut in small, small pieces. And that bread also they would keep under lock and key for the entire day. And Jean Victor tells us that all the time he was hungry. He was with them for 3 years and he was in a continual fit of hunger. He was extremely hungry the entire time of the day. Ah, you were astonished just now when you saw me take the bread out of the mud. I am used to that, for I have picked up enough of it. And crusts from the dust, and when they were too hard and dry, I would soak them all night in my basin. So he tells us another very heartbreaking thing that, he asks the Duke that you were very shocked when you saw me take out the bread out of the mud and eat it. But it is not anything which is new for me because I have done this earlier as well. And I'm used to it. I have a habit of doing it. He says, not only the bread, I have also taken out the crusts from the bread. Crust, the hard bread also. And if the bread, that piece of crust, if that was too hard for me to eat, I would put it in water the entire night so it would get soft and then I would eat it. And while on errands, I used to try and prowl around in the sidewalks for pieces of bread and nibbled at the ends, which the children would take out of their baskets and throw on the sidewalks as they came from the school. He further tells that while on errands means whenever he used to go for work. Errands means work. So when he would go for work, he used to try and prowl around. He would search in the sidewalks for the pieces of bread that nibbled at the ends, that stuck onto the ends. What pieces of bread? He says that the children who would come back from the school, they would at times take out the bread off their baskets and throw it. And those pieces would get stuck onto the walls. I would scratch them and eat them. This is how he has been. At last my time was ended at this trade by which no man can support himself. Well, I did many other things. I served masons. I have been a shop boy, floor polisher. I don't know what more. He says that finally my time ended this trade. Being the helper of that chair mender. He says finally that job of mine came to an end. A job which no man can support himself with, something that nobody can earn, nobody can feed himself if you're working, in such a job. And then he tells us that he did a lot of other things. He worked with masons. Masons are those people who make the bricks. So he worked with masons. He has been a shop boy, the helper of the shop. He used to polish the floors and whatnot. Briefly, I have never had enough to eat. Heavens, how often have I been crazy with hunger as I have passed the bakeries? Fortunately for me, at all these times I have always remembered the good sister at the asylum who so often told me to be honest, and I seemed to feel her warm little hand upon my forehead. At last, when I was 18, I enlisted. So he says that briefly, that in short, if I tell you about myself, I have never had enough to eat. He says that, I cannot even tell you there are times when I would pass by the bakery, I would go crazy with hunger. But then all this time, I would think about that kind sister who always taught me and told me to be honest. And I would feel her warm hand over my forehead. He says that finally, when I was 18 years of age, I enlisted. I got myself to be a part of the army. Now I could almost laugh. Here is the siege and famine. You see, I did not lie when I told you just now that I have always been hungry. He says, and now I can actually laugh at myself and say that here is the siege and the famine, that there has always been shortage and scarcity of food for me to eat. And he told the Duke that I did not lie to you when I said that I have always been hungry. I was true. I said truth. The young Duke had a kind heart and was profoundly moved by this terrible story, told him by a man like himself, by a soldier whose uniform made him his equal. Now, our Duke, he was a very kind man and he was profoundly moved. He was deeply moved. He got very emotional by the story, the terrible story of this man who was now his equal, because he was wearing the same uniform that the Duke wore. So that made him his equal. So, my dear students, we saw the plight of Jane Victor. We saw the amount of hunger he was dealing with and how difficult he had been surviving for all these years. I'm going to pause here now, and in my next video, I shall complete the explanation of the chapter as well as discuss the back exercises. So I shall see you all now in my next lecture.